Welcome back to the Spoon Sports Podcast, a podcast examining current issues and topics in sports by exploring their history. There's not a whole lot to cover in the current events part of this episode, since the last episode is fairly recent, but football season is officially over, so let's get started with the Super Bowl. The Chiefs defeated the 49ers 25-22 and became the first back-to-back champions in the NFL since the Patriots in 2003 and 2004. The 49ers got off to a 10-0 lead, and Jawan Jennings had a breakout game with a passing touchdown to Christian McCaffrey and a receiving touchdown. With the score 19-16, Patrick Mahomes led a clutch drive to send the game into overtime. The 49ers made a very surprising decision to receive the ball first in overtime and were forced to settle for a field goal. The Chiefs got the ball back, and Mahomes cemented himself as one of the best playoff quarterbacks of all time, leading the game-winning drive ending with a touchdown pass to Mecole Hardman. Now we can talk about the NBA. The Celtics have maintained the best record in the NBA pretty much the whole season. The top four in the West is very tight between the Timberwolves, the Thunder, the Clippers, and the Nuggets. There have not been a whole lot of league-altering moves between teams, but there are some notable ones. The Pacers got Pascal Siakam from the Raptors. The Heat and the Hornets swapped Kyle Lowry and Terry Rozier. And Buddy Hield went from the Pacers to the 76ers for picks. Now for All-Star Weekend, this has been a very controversial topic in recent sports news. The three-point contest was as exciting as always, with Damian Lillard as the winner, but the dunk contest was not great. It was plagued with bad dunks and even worse scoring. Mac McClung won for the second year in a row, but the scoring just didn't make any sense. They started so high. I think Mac McClung's first dunk got like a 47 out of 50, but you really can only go up from there, so it just didn't make any sense to start that high. There were plenty of dunks that were worse than that, but they still got up in the 47s and the 48s, when realistically they should have gotten about a 43. The entirety of All-Star Weekend was really just a big flop for the NBA. It caused a lot of controversy. Many were upset with the NBA All-Star Game, with its lack of effort from players and little to no defense. A lot of players shared their perspective on the All-Star break being more of a break than an actual game, but fans and the commissioner were really upset. Now for some college basketball. It continues to be college basketball. Top teams continue to lose to lesser teams on the road. UConn got blown out by Creighton. Just today, Duke loses to Wake Forest on the road, and Kyle Filipowski gets hurt as fans storm the court. That has created a lot of controversy just today. Ohio State fires their head coach, Chris Holtmann, after a 14-11 start, and in their first game with the interim head coach, they beat the number 2 team in the country, Purdue. Finally, for some Major League Baseball. Spring training is officially upon us. There are a lot of familiar faces, but in new places. Shohei Ohtani stays in LA, but he's with the Dodgers. Corbin Burns is now with the Orioles. Juan Soto with the Yankees. Jorge Soler with the Giants, Josh Hader with the Astros, Tyler Glasnow also with the Dodgers, and Marcus Stroman also with the Yankees. That concludes the current events for this episode, and today I'll be discussing issues related to mega sporting events like the Olympics and the World Cup with an expert in this field, Dr. Matthew Llewellyn. Dr. Llewellyn was born in Cardiff, South Wales, United Kingdom, and has been actively involved in sport and physical activity throughout his whole life. He earned a master's degree in kinesiology from California State, Long Beach, and a PhD in the historical and philosophical aspects of sport and physical activity at Penn State University. Matt has successfully published over 30 papers in refereed journals, including the Journal of Sport History, Contemporary British History, and the International Journal of the History of Sport, as well as numerous textbook chapters. He has published several books and edited collections, including The Rise and Fall of Olympic Amateurism and Rule Britannia, Nationalism, Identity in the Modern Olympic Games. Matt currently serves as editor of the Journal of Olympic Studies and is a co-director of the Center for Sociocultural Sport and Olympic Research. Now please enjoy this discussion with Professor Matt Llewellyn. Now I have here with me Professor Matt Llewellyn. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
You have a fascinating and diverse background in studying the history of sport. Before we get to any specific questions, can you tell me a little bit about how you became interested in this topic and about your position at Cal State Fullerton?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So, I would say like most people who gravitate towards sport history, my attraction to the field essentially stemmed from my love of sport. I was raised by my father. He loved sport. He played soccer growing up. So it was essentially my childhood. I followed him to games. By the age of 5 or 6, I started to play soccer myself. My love of soccer then translated into playing cricket and rugby. I ran track and field. So I always had this avid love of sports, of games, of movement, of competition. At the same time, I wasn't the greatest student. I was more focused on playing sports than my schoolwork. But the one subject that I always loved was the study of the past, of history. So I remember being an undergraduate student. I graduate high school, I go to college, I'm playing soccer in college, and I enroll as an undergraduate student in kinesiology, the study of human movement. And I can think back to my sophomore year in college. I took a sport history class, and it was almost as if the stars aligned. My love of history, my love of sport fused together. I knew that light bulb went on in that moment, that this is what I wanted essentially to do in the future. I wanted to teach and study sport history. So from there, I graduate college in the UK. I moved to the US. I pursue a master's degree in kinesiology with an emphasis in sport history. From then, I move on to the doctorate level. I get a PhD in sport history at the Pennsylvania State University. And way back when, in 2010, I took a job out on the West Coast at the California State University, Fullerton. I've been working there ever since. I teach courses on the history of sports, games and culture. I teach a course on the Olympic Games. So yeah, long story, but essentially started out with just a general love of sports and competition.
You've published on a wide array of topics, and we could do this interview about a dozen different things, but you mentioned your passion for soccer in addition to your extensive research on the Olympic Games, so we're going to focus on the history of the Olympics and the World Cup. I'm interested to hear about some comparisons and contrasts between these two enormous events, but I think we need to establish some context first. So perhaps you can start by giving us a quick overview of the history of the modern Olympics.
Yeah, okay, here we go. So I first want to acknowledge there's probably been about 10,000 books, 100,000 articles, many of which have been written by your dad on the history of the Olympics. But, as we know, in the 21st century, the modern Olympic Games are the world's largest multinational, multi-sport event on the planet. But it's important to note that the Games were not born fully grown. Rather, they evolved gradually over a period of time. So the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece in 1896. It's important to recognize that the Games were in many ways an imitation of the ancient games, the ancient Greek games that were held for almost 1,200 years. They stop in, we believe, roughly 394 AD. The Olympic flame is then extinguished for the next 1,500 years. By the mid to late 1800s, all across Europe, we witness numerous attempts to revive the Olympic Games in a modern context. The person credited with reviving the modern Olympics, which was a French aristocrat, a man by the name of the Baron Pierre de Coubertin. He's the man credited with bringing the Olympic Games to fruition. De Coubertin was an aristocrat. He's born into wealth and privilege. He grows up during the bleakest moment in French history. The French Empire had collapsed, trade declines, birth rates decline, crime rates soar. It's a really, really bleak moment. And as a young aristocratic man of wealth and power and privilege, de Coubertin makes it his life goal, in his words, to rebronze France. He wants to make France shiny and bright once again. So he sets off on a mission. He uses his own wealth, and he begins to travel the Western world. And in particular, he spends time in the US. He visits San Francisco. He travels to the East Coast, visits a number of Ivy League universities. He also spends lots of time in England, particularly at Oxford and Cambridge University. And he comes with a goal. He wants to identify what is it that makes these two great countries, the US and Great Britain, so great. He's trying to identify that secret recipe. Because if he can identify the recipe, he can introduce it to France, and he can use that to help make France great once again. And we're told, or rather he tells us, that while watching schoolboys play at rugby school in England, there's an elite boarding school in England called Rugby. He's there. He's, according to him, he's looking out the window. He's seeing these young boys competing and wrestling and fighting for control of the ball. And it's at that precise moment, he tells us, the light bulb goes off. He comes up with the idea that the secret to British and American strength is their sporting and their athletic culture. So over the next 5 or 6 years, de Coubertin strives and struggles to introduce British and American style sports and systems of physical education to France. We're told that his efforts fail. So it's in these years now, de Coubertin stumbles upon the idea of reviving the Olympic Games. He tells us he comes up with the idea to revive the Olympic Games as a means to introduce modern sporting culture to France. Now, scholars argue that de Coubertin did not come up with that idea all by himself, that rather he imitates and copies a number of initiatives taking place around Europe. So there were lots of different actors all striving to create a modern Olympics on a national and essentially an international scale. But de Coubertin was the one. He had the money, he had the influence, he had the charm, certainly had the intellect. He brings people together in Paris at Sorbonne University in June of 1894. He wines them, he dines them, he gets them drunk, he takes to the stage and announces his grand idea: let's revive the modern Olympics. So the games were essentially revived. The International Olympic Committee was established, and the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens in 1896.
Well, that's a great history of the start of the modern Olympics. I would imagine some of my American listeners who aren't soccer fans are less familiar with the origins of the World Cup. So can you give some background on that event?
Yeah, for sure. So it's a much shorter story, I promise. So the first Soccer World Cup, the first FIFA Men's World Cup, was held in 1930. It was held in Uruguay. Uruguay at the time were the world's leading men's national soccer team. They had won the gold medal at the previous 2 Olympic Games in the soccer tournament in both 1924 and in 1928. So the first Soccer World Cup, Men's World Cup, was held in Uruguay in 1930. I think it's important to recognize, though, the interconnected histories between the modern Olympic Games and FIFA and the World Cup. Because prior to 1930, the de facto World Cup, the unofficial World Cup, was the soccer tournament every 4 years at the Summer Olympics. And essentially what was happening was fans loved the soccer tournament. They came in huge numbers to watch Olympic soccer. And soccer was generating lots and lots of money in ticket sales. So much so that FIFA realized they wanted a slice of the pie. So as a consequence, they went off by themselves and they established in 1930 their first official World Cup.
These are 2 of the biggest and most watched sporting events in the world. Historically, is there any relationship between the 2? Do the organizations interact with each other, or are they completely separate? I know my friends and I got into a conversation, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, about just the difference between the Olympics and the World Cup and what makes, I guess, the World Cup so special to soccer fans. Do you think you can give some background to that?
Yeah, okay. So I think it's important to recognize there's an intimate but a strained relationship between the Olympic movement, the IOC, and FIFA, the governing body of global soccer. Soccer has been present in the Olympic Games almost from the start, with the exception of the first games in 1896. And again, I believe in LA in 1932, there's always been an Olympic soccer tournament. The problem is FIFA does not need, or soccer does not need, the Olympic Games. So how the Olympic Games works is the IOC oversees the management of the games in some way, but they are wholly dependent on international sporting federations to run and govern and administer their sport during the Olympic fortnight. Most international sporting federations are desperate to be included in the Olympic Games because the Olympic Games attract billions of global viewers. They generate billions of dollars in revenue. Most sports are desperate. They clamor to be on the Olympic program. The exception is truly soccer, because soccer is the most played, the most watched, the most loved and most popular sport on the planet. So FIFA does not need the Olympic Games, but the IOC, the Olympics, need soccer. So there's always been this tension, and it's because it's the only sport that has the grip, the hold, the power, essentially over the IOC. So with the exception of 2 Olympics, there's always been a soccer tournament. But that tournament since the 1930s hasn't been well received. And here's why. FIFA does not want the Olympic soccer tournament to conflict or compete with its World Cup tournament. So as a consequence, like for instance, now they pass a rule that only players under the age of 23 can take part. And they do this to ensure that their standalone World Cup soccer tournament is essentially unrivaled. So there's always been a connection, that they've got a deep history. The 2 organizations and 2 games are essentially interconnected, but that relationship has always been strained.
Yeah, those are some really insightful points that I guess neither I or my friends had thought about during that conversation. The IOC and FIFA have both gone through scandals over the years that have left some fans wondering if someone else could be in charge. Can you talk about how some of those scandals and how both organizations have overcome them, or have they overcome them at all?
Okay, great question, Andrew. Really, really great question. And honestly, we could probably spend about 30 years talking about all of the, talking about all the scandals that have gripped both the IOC and FIFA. In a nutshell, I would say that most of their problems have stemmed around 2 things. The first of which is the involvement of the state. Governments have seized upon and appropriated the run-in and management and staging of these huge sporting mega events. So cast our minds back to 1930. It's the first FIFA World Cup. It was held in Uruguay. And again, a strange place for the hosting a mega event. But Uruguay's government agreed to pay full hosting costs because the summer of 1930 coincided with the centennial celebration of the founding of modern Uruguay. So from its inception, the FIFA World Cup has been intimately connected to the role of governments, of power, of propaganda and politics. This trend would continue. 1934, the second World Cup held in Rome, Italy. As we know, sweeping across Europe during the late 1920s and 30s, we have right-wing authoritarian regimes. In Italy, Italy's led under the grip of Benito Mussolini, a fascist leader. He seizes full control of the hosting and organization of the second World Cup. He threatens his players with death if they don't win. He bribes, and he even recruits top players from Argentina, grants them passports and gives them an opportunity to represent Italy, and the Italians are victorious. From there, we go to the 1936 Olympic Games in Germany, Berlin, Germany. And as we know, those games were essentially stage managed by the Nazis. Hitler seized upon the games in order to proclaim and demonstrate the strength and supremacy of his Aryan master race. So from the beginning, most of the problems that both the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup have experienced and continue to experience stem simply from the involvement of the state. Governments keen to appropriate the games in order to use them as a tool to showcase the nation as a means of propaganda. It's just ongoing. And, we think of the IOC, think of the most recent World Cup in Qatar, right? These movements, these events are kind of mired in scandal and bribery because governments are so desperate to host these mega events. I think the second problem as well stems from the issue of nationalism. When athletes compete at the Olympic Games or when they compete in the World Cup of Soccer, they compete as representatives of their nation states. That also causes problems too, because it means that governments and athletes, because they're representing not just themselves, but the nations, it leads to issues of scandal, doping, cheating, drug use. I think most of the problems that afflict and have always afflicted these two great events have stemmed around nationalism and the involvement of governments.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the ways that the Olympics and the World Cup might be similar, and I know you also mentioned some differences. Are there any other differences between the two events that you would like to mention?
Yeah, so differences. So both are global mega events. Both attract billions of global viewers, generate billions of dollars in revenue. Both attract commercial sponsors and endorsements. One obviously is a multi-sporting event, the Olympics, whereas the FIFA World Cup is a single sporting event. I think the one major difference is the Olympic movement claims to be above sport. It is not just sport. The Olympic movement, as guided by the Olympic Charter, is a social movement. The Olympic Games are about friendship, fraternity, internationalism, international understanding, friendship across borders. So whereas the FIFA World Cup is essentially a commercial, a professional soccer event, the Olympic Games claim to be a social movement, where sport is a means, a platform for bringing different cultures around the world together and compete in the name of friendship and fair play.
Yeah, so I guess now we can move a little bit more specifically into soccer. I talked with another one of my guests, Ashley Witherspoon, about the book, How Soccer Explains the World. What is your take on it, and what is it about soccer that makes it so popular?
Oh, another great question. So soccer is the global game, right? And I think back to my own childhood. I remember playing soccer every single day of the week, playing it on fields, on streets, in alleys, on beaches. I remember as a kid, I'd roll up pairs of socks together, kind of create my own little soccer ball, and I'd kick that around the house. If I couldn't find socks, I'd find a tennis ball, a beach ball. Soccer is the global game. It's played by 211 countries around the world. FIFA had 211 representative member nation states. There are more soccer playing nations than there are nations represented at the UN. The UN, I believe, last time I checked, has 193 nations. FIFA has 211. So there are more soccer playing nations than there are actual nations, which again, I think speaks to the global nature of the game. So the game globalizes so quickly. It's the most played, it's the most watched, it's the most loved sport in the world. And I think it's, for me, kind of ironic. I grew up in one of the only countries in the world in which soccer wasn't the national sport and pastime. I grew up in Wales, which is a rugby playing nation. I then moved to the US, and the US, like Wales, is also one of the few nations where soccer isn't the national pastime. But generally speaking, soccer took hold, it took root, and it took root among the working classes in Britain and the working classes across Europe and essentially the working classes globally. And I think it's because of the inherent affordability of soccer. It's easy to play, right? You don't need cricket bats or baseball gloves. It's inherently very, very affordable. It can be played with just a ball. And, you know, like me as a child, you didn't even need a standardized soccer ball. You could just fuse together a couple of pairs of socks. The game is inherently affordable. It's also adaptable. It can be played in a variety of different formats. It can be played in an official game on a standardized field. It can be played on a beach. It can be played against a wall. It can be played just 2-on-2, 1-on-1, 11v11, 5-on-5. The game is affordable, it's adaptable, and at its most inherent level, at its most basic level, it's simplistic to play. Most kids, especially in this country, in the US, the first sport they play at the age of 4 or 5 is not tackle football, it's not baseball or softball, it's soccer. Because every kid inherently can comprehend the game. Kick the ball into your opponent's net. So soccer globalizes because, for those 3 reasons. It's born in Britain in the elite male public schools in England, and it then travels globally through imperial networks. Soldiers, merchants, church leaders, they take the game with them everywhere they go. And very quickly, the sport globalizes and takes root. This process began in the mid to late 1800s. So when you think about the history of soccer now, it's, the rules were codified in the early 1860s. The sport's 160 years old, and it globalized very, very early on in its history. So the sport is loved, it's adored, it's appreciated almost everywhere in the globe. It's spread further than the English language. It's spread further than the Christian faith. It's spread further than McDonald's and Coca-Cola. It's Britain's most successful cultural export. And again, I think as you know already, I'm biased. I think it takes root because it's a great game. It's fun to play.
So I think obviously soccer in the U.S. recently has been catching it seemed like a lot of my friends play it. And I did play it growing up. Do you have, I guess, a hypothesis as to why it hasn't always been so popular in the U.S., maybe relative to American football or baseball?
Yeah, another great question. These are theories that I think can be rooted in fact, but there is a strong impulse in America, right? The spirit of 1776. America is a nation born in opposition to Britain, and early American leaders, post-independence, they're constantly trying to separate themselves from the orbit of British culture. When the first team sports from England come to the US, cricket is played and it's loved. I don't know if you know this, but the US competed in the first international test match cricket game. They competed against Canada in 1844. So in the early years of the founding of this great country, English sports take root, notably cricket and soccer. The first intercollegiate football game, I think, was in 1869. They were playing soccer. They were kicking around the soccer ball and playing in accordance with soccer rules. What we start to see happening around this era, though, is a deliberate attempt to to reinvent these English games. The game of soccer is essentially rejected. The English game of rugby football union, is morphed by Walter Camp at Yale University into a distinctly American code of football that will be called American football. So I think there was always a anti-British kind of attitude that stymied the growth and development of soccer in this country. I was always shocked when I first moved to the States as a graduate student back in 2004, and I told people that I liked soccer, and they started saying, how can you play that sport? It's a communist sport. Which to me blew my mind, because soccer wasn't a communist sport. It was an English sport. It was developed and cultivated in Britain. So you've got a couple of things going on here. Soccer has always been viewed as British, as an outside sport, something we want to reject in order to promote our own distinctly American sporting pastimes. And then somewhere along the way, post-World War II, soccer and the playing of soccer and the history of soccer gets connected to communism, the Cold War, the Soviet Union. So there's always this strong anti kind of soccer culture or attitude. But I think the sands are shifting. Among American youths, boys and girls, young men and young women, soccer is the most played sport in this country. When we look at surveys, when they poll young people, what's the sport they like the most? What's the sport they most watch the most in this country? Soccer suddenly ranks really high. it usually falls second on that list, just below American football. So soccer is the fastest growing sport in this country. It's the most played sport in this country. So I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of soccer in America.
Yeah, I think that there's a lack of popularity for American Major League Soccer, the MLS. Do you think that all of what you just said plays a role in that, or is there something specific about the league, maybe just like the lack of talent, that is also part of it?
Yeah, these are complex questions, and the answers, I think, are also nuanced and complex. I think there's two sides to this, right? I think it's important to recognize that the women's game is flourishing. The US, for the most part, is the preeminent women's national team. When you look at the history, the Olympic gold medals, the World Cup victories, grassroots soccer in this country is very strong. I think on the professional side, we now have a stable men's league. It's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, but it's stable. And it's been stable now for almost 30 years. And I think that's a really, really good sign. There's more franchises popping up. More franchises are building their own stadiums, which is also a positive sign of growth and strength. On the women's side, there have been a number of fledgling and failed professional structures, but now there seems to be a positive women's professional system in place. So, it's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, it isn't European soccer. It's not the Premier League, but it's important to recognize that those European cultures, Latin American cultures, have a long history in the game. They've had over a century in which to allow their professional leagues to develop. So again, I'm cautiously optimistic. The pro leagues in this country, they're small in scale, but they're healthy. They attract a stable fan base. The games are broadcasted on TV. The viewerships of those games, though not great, are at least stable and healthy.
Well, as I conclude each episode, I invite my guests to contemplate the present and the future of the issues they're talking about. So for this, I have a series of questions, and the first one will move back into the Olympics. We're in an Olympic year, but the Summer Olympics in Paris is just a few months away. What are some of the current issues troubling the Olympics?
To be a IOC member at the moment, because there's lots of issues. First and most obvious one is Russia. The Russia-Ukraine conflict poses numerous geopolitical issues for the IOC. Whether they grant an invitation to Russian athletes to compete, that's an issue they've been wrestling with. Russia, as we know, have also been marred over the past 5, 6, 7 years in a statewide doping scandal. So we've got issues of doping. We've got issues of geopolitical war and conflict. What role should the IOC play in these conflicts? Should they, as had been the history of the movement, to be above politics, to hold on tight to the mantra, sport and politics don't mix? That was basically the IOC guidebook through the 60s and 70s and 80s during the midst of the Cold War. The IOC just basically remained above the fray. Yeah, there's war going on, but we're not going to get involved. We're exclusively about sport. Over the past 20 years, the IOC have moved away from that kind of mantra and philosophy, and they're now carefully interjecting themselves in these global geopolitical conflicts. But they're doing so selectively. So human rights abuses in China get overlooked, but Russia invades a sovereign country and the IOC involves themselves in that affair. So I think the IOC need to be very, very careful. I'm not arguing for one way or the other. I just think they need to be consistent in the application of their rules. Human rights abuses are taking place in Russia, in Ukraine today, following the Russian invasion of a sovereign country. If that's a crime, so are the human rights abuses in China. I think there's also another looming issue, and that is the spiraling costs of hosting a 2-week global Olympic mega event. The costs are astronomical. The construction of new stadiums, security costs. The games have just become simply too expensive. And I think you've seen across the Western world, European nations have been voting down the opportunity to host the games. They're simply too expensive. In the 70s and 80s, numerous countries, in the 90s and the early 2000s, numerous cities bid with ferocity for the right to host the games. Those bids are now simply drying up. This is especially true, unfortunately, of the Winter Olympics. Very few city-states are stepping forward and bidding to host the games. What we have left now is essentially authoritarian countries, notably China, for instance. They're one of the few countries that actively wants to bid to host the games. I think the Olympics have been saved by France, by Paris, the birthplace of its founder, the Baron Pierre de Coubertin. They've also been saved once again by LA, who will host the games, as we know, in 2028. Beyond that, the future of the games are uncertain, and I just don't know where the IOC goes next. I think they're going to have to find ways to make the games affordable. Simply put, affordable. Governments don't have the money. They don't want to, taxpayers don't want to stump up the money to construct new stadiums, new media centers, new ice rinks, new velodromes for a 2-week festival. So I think the cost of hosting is an issue. I think there are also issues as well surrounding environmental issues, protection issues. What is the ecological and environmental damage caused to regions by hosting the games? And I think, when you start huge scale construction, it's obviously going to have a negative impact. So lots of issues surrounding hosting, the cost of hosting, security, environmental issues to consider. And as always, in every stage of human history, there's conflict. And the IOC needs to be consistent in its application of its rules and in its application of bans and consequences.
So when you say that the U.S. With LA and France with the Paris Olympics saved like the IOC and, well, maybe not the IOC, but saved the Olympics from these more authoritarian countries, do you mean just save them from like them being able to promote themselves? Like, I'm just wondering what exactly you mean.
Oh yeah, great question. So sorry to clarify here. So save the Olympic movement in terms of stepping up to the plate and agreeing to host the games. Because if not Paris, if not LA, whom? China's already hosted the games recently. It hosted the Summer Games in 2008. It hosted the Winter Olympics more recently. Again, it's stepping in to host the Winter Olympics again in the near future. If not Paris and LA, the IOC are essentially left with few alternatives. Could the Summer Olympic Games go back to China so soon after the 2008 Beijing Olympics? That's essentially not what they want, right? They want the games to be global. They want them to continually move from international city to international city. The problem they have is there are very few international cities who are willing to stump up the costs to host the games.
Well, now that we've covered some of your predictions about the Olympics, what about the World Cup? Messi and Argentina finally got their World Cup win in 2022, and in 2026, it returns to North America. Are there issues surrounding the World Cup or soccer more generally that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, this is another interesting question. There will always be issues surrounding soccer simply because of the incompetence of FIFA. The leadership of FIFA is grossly incompetent, and they've marred the organization in one scandal after another. There's so much money generated in global soccer that FIFA's hands are continually in the pot, and it leads to bribery, it leads to scandal, it leads to corruption. FIFA leadership can't be trusted, and even though they attempt to clean house, new leaders, new presidents, the same acts follow, the same scandal, the same bribery, the same corruption. So at the organizational level, the administrative level, there's certainly issues surrounding the global governance of soccer. But in terms of the sport itself, I think it's vibrant, it's healthy, its viewership numbers are incredibly strong, as I referenced earlier, the game is global. It's the most watched, it's the most played sport globally. And, the vibrancy and health of soccer is fantastic. It's just, are the governors of the global game the right people to manage the sport and to take the game forward? I don't think so. I don't know how that changes. I don't know, all their attempts to reform take place from within. And I think what we see then is just these very mild, superficial attempts to change. Same types of characters, same types of decision making, awarding the games to Qatar, the last World Cup, strange decision, undoubtedly, objectively fueled by money and bribery and scandal. I don't know what happens with the global governance of the game. I don't trust the FIFA leadership, but the game itself is very, very healthy and very vibrant.
Well, we've covered a lot of great topics. And finally, looking ahead 5 or 10 years, what do you think will be the big issues we'll be talking about with both of these events, the Olympics and the World Cup, or international sport more broadly?
Yeah, another great question. The Olympic Games, I think there are two central issues. Number one is the IOC, the Olympic movement, is struggling to attract a younger generation of viewer. The Olympic Games have had incredible success. The viewership numbers have consistently increased until now. They've reached a plateau, and the viewership numbers are starting to decline. And I think that stems from the fact that young people aren't accessing or watching the Olympic Games in the same way as my generation and generations before me. So this leads to two issues now. The IOC is desperately and deliberately trying to market itself to a much younger audience. So we're seeing the introduction of alternative style sports, skateboarding, for example, right? And I think that will be the trend. How can we continually keep the Olympic movement at the forefront? How can we continue to keep the Olympic Games as being the preeminent multi-sport event on the planet? And they're going to have to find ways to consistently attract young viewers. And that means that traditional events that have been part of Olympic history might lose their Olympic place. I'm thinking of sports like wrestling. Wrestling doesn't necessarily translate into a good broadcasting spectacle, and wrestling isn't a especially watched and loved sport globally. So those types of old established Olympic sports will most likely make way, and we'll see a new array of alternative style sports that are incredibly attractive to young audiences. I think on that issue as well, the way young people access the Olympic Games, my generation, previous generations, we sat in front of a box and we watched the games on TV. We watch it on NBC in the US. But young people aren't sitting down to watch TV in the same way as older generations. So how can the Olympic movement market and broadcast the games in a way that's attractive and appealing to young people? So they're going to have to find ways to target social media platforms, streaming content live versus, I don't know, I sound like an old man here. Twitch, is that a streaming platform? For Instagram, Snapchat, they're just going to have to find new ways to market and sell the games to a much younger audience. I think the same is also true of the World Cup, but to a much lesser extent, just because younger people are conditioned to watching live soccer through club soccer in Europe and Latin America and Asia. I think the Olympic Games is unique because you're asking young people to watch diving and volleyball and sports they typically wouldn't watch or access. And then as for soccer, again, it goes back to what I talked about in my previous question, is simply corruption. FIFA, are they the right governors of the global game? Can they reform the sport at an organizational level and keep the sport kind of healthy and wholesome and vibrant? I don't know. Question marks loom. I don't know.
Well, that is all the questions that I have. Matt, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated you joining me.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, that concludes the last episode of the Spoon Sports Podcast. This is the end for now. I'm not sure about the future of this series. There might be more episodes to come, but as of right now, that will be the last episode. I want to say thank you to all the people that I was able to interview, all of the experts. I appreciate them so much for being able to do this with me. I also wanted to say some thank yous to everyone who ever listened, everyone who ever contributed any ideas to this podcast. They were all super helpful. I wanted to say thank you to Miss Taylor again for always being so helpful and supportive. And of course, this would not be possible without my mentor, Aslan Hunter Vandy. He has been super helpful, giving me support all the time throughout this whole series. Thank you so much. Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening.